Hey everyone, this is the first class for the course, and today we'll be talking about biases and fallacies. Let's get started. What is a cognitive bias or a cognitive error? It's a pattern of thought that systematically leads us to irrational or incorrect conclusions. It's called cognitive bias. What gives rise to cognitive biases? Because our brain has been evolutionarily hardwired for fast thinking and making decisions when you don't have time to analyze all the options and enough time to think. However, we often use these same quick thinking processes, also known as cognitive biases, for slow thinking solutions. For example, when you meet a tiger, you want to be able to quickly make a decision. However, when we start using that same mechanism for places when you have time to think, we often make cognitive errors. So what can we do to prevent these biases? Well, we don't want to get rid of them because it's useful for quick decisions. We do need to make sure that we don't use them in the slow thinking problems and when we do need to think slowly and rationally. We can do this by learning what these biases are and identifying them when we do make them. Types of biases. There is the belief bias, availability heuristic, conjunction fallacy, halo horns effect, affect heuristic, confirmation bias, self verification, imposter syndrome, and self handicapping. The first one is belief bias. So, judging an argument based on what we believe about the conclusion rather than the actual strength of the arguments. One example of that is I would deny climate change, and thus I support any person who says that without actually listening to their argument. So, that would be one way of just believing in whatever you want to believe in, regardless of what the person is saying. The next one is availability heuristic. So this one is about jumping to conclusions based on limited and available information. So when you don't have the whole picture, but you're still making decisions and solutions and coming to conclusions based on that small information that you do have. If a judge had limited information and didn't hear the whole story and came to a conclusion about a person and sent him to jail. All right. The conjunction fallacy. So the conjunction fallacy is the conjunction of two events is judged to be more probable than one of the other events. So this is a bit more complicated, and an example of that is the Linda problem. So Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. So now the question is, what is more probable? Linda is a bank teller, option A, or Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement? You can pause the video and you can think about the answer because I'm going to discuss the answer in the next slide. All right. So the solution is actually A. And a lot of people make the mistake of putting the answer as B. And that's understandable because all the information here makes it seem like she's into social justice and she's deeply concerned with issues of discrimination. But in reality, that doesn't affect the probability. This is just irrelevant information when it comes to the question. In terms of probability, the answer is A. Because if Linda is a bank teller and a feminist, then she has to be a bank teller as well, right? But not all bank tellers are feminists. So it's more probable that she's just a bank teller than being a feminist. And you can see that in this graph right here, because the pink circle over here shows that the number of bank tellers that are feminists, and the blue one shows that the number of bank tellers. So obviously the number of bank tellers are way more than the number of bank tellers that are feminists. So the probability of getting her being a bank teller is obviously going to be more as well. All right. So halo horns effect, the tendency of an impression created in one area to influence the impression in other non-related areas as well. This example says that just because someone is not good at public speaking, you judge them to be not smart and don't select them for your math team, even though they could be good at math, for example, and them being not good at public speaking has nothing to do with that. Another example could be if someone is good at logic, for example, then someone might assume that you're good at chess, when in reality, that might not be the case. One tip to solve these questions related to this bias is recognize whenever qualities are listed down in a question. So whenever there are specific qualities like being good at public speaking or being good at math, then you most probably know that it's the halo horns effect. Not always, but it's worth trying, you know? All right. Affect heuristic. We jump to conclusions based on emotions. How do we feel about it is the rationale in the head rather than what do you think about it. So this one is basically putting emotions above rationale. A lot of people tend to make this bias in their arguments. For example, if you dislike something, you're more likely not to appreciate it. One other example would be there's a person who you don't like, who is giving a speech or is teaching you something. You're less likely to be listening to them and more likely to be not liking what they're saying, even though It's not because of the content of what their argument states, but it's more because what you feel about that person. The next one is confirmation bias. The tendency for people to search for and interpret information in a way that conforms to their already held perceptions. That is known as confirmation bias. For example, again, the spelling is wrong, but confirmation bias essentially states that you believe in something and you're actively trying to feed yourself the information that supports that belief. And I think that's normal because we as humans like to not be wrong, and we actively try to seek out information that conforms to our beliefs. For example, someone will watch Fox News because it spews information that conforms with their political views. And someone, on the other hand, might watch MSNBC because they support what MSNBC correspondents and journalists are more likely to say. All right. And now there's another type of confirmation bias known as self-verification. This is essentially the drive to reinforce one's positive self-image. This often happens in our own head when we make a decision and we try to justify it by making up excuses in our own head for it, even though we know deep inside that it's wrong. We don't want to be wrong, so we kind of feed ourselves that information. Another type of confirmation bias, imposter syndrome. So I'm sure you guys have heard of this. This is the drive to reinforce one's negative self-image. It's the opposite of self-verification, focusing too much on the negatives rather than the positives. In this way, in self-verification, you're kind of blinded. You kind of ignore all your flaws completely and you focus only on the good things, which can be self-detrimental. But over here as well, imposter syndrome can also be very dangerous because you're only focusing on the negatives and completely ignoring all the positives. An example of this is when you overwork or are perfectionist because you don't want others to find out that you're not actually good at these things. So you tend to like try to be perfect at everything, when in reality you realize that most people are just as good as you. You're not any worse than them, and we all struggle from the same things. So that's a little therapy session in the middle of the class to who needed it. All right. The next type of confirmation bias is known as self-handicapping, creating conditions of failure to protect one's ego before the thing even happens, acting like you're sick before a test, so you have an excuse if you do bad. It's basically like insurance. So you say something, for example, if you go for the test and you know you haven't studied well for it, but you say that, oh, I'm sick, so even if I don't do well on this test, it's completely fine. And then you don't do well on the test, and then you blame it on the fact that you're sick. It's basically like a backup insurance just in case things don't work out. In high school, people would do that when they would go to a test and say, oh, I haven't really studied for this test. Like I had like a game last night. And then that's basically because they don't want to embarrass themselves when they do get a bad grade. If they do get a good grade, then nothing bad's going to happen. But if they get a bad grade, then they have this insurance card which they can pull out and say that, hey, I told you I was watching a game last night. Okay, so a few tips for all these biases are that firstly, the type of questions that'll come in the test are you'll have to identify the type of bias that's used and you have to define it. For example, the question might say that identify the type of bias in the statement and explain why this bias is used. So you might need to know the definition, not exactly word to word, but you need to know how to explain that bias when they ask you to explain it. All right. And another tip is no bias is asked twice in the test. So if you feel like you already got halo horns effect, and then the second question you also feel like it's halo horns effect, then one of those is wrong. Now let's start with fallacies. An argument is a piece of reasoning meant to justify or support a certain thesis called the conclusion. When reasoning behind the argument is erroneous, then it is known as fallacious. It can be fallacious for various reasons, and those reasons are the different types of fallacies. For example, essentially arguments are arguments that we make in debates, in statements, and many times these arguments are fallacious and they are not. The fallacies in arguments are essentially like cheating. If you want to recognize them, if you want to not make them, we need to understand when we do make them and recognize the different types of fallacies that exist. All right, so these are different types of fallacies. There are 23 of them. Yeah, we'll be going through them one by one, and a few of them are more important than the others. So they're marked with a star on the top. Ad hominem, fallacy of the stick. So this one is appealing to force in order to silence or threaten the opponent, essentially just threatening the person rather than actually caring about and trying to convince them using sound argument. Example of this would be bringing a really big, tall, like bouncer with you to a debate with a stick in his hand, so that even if you don't make a good argument, the other person is forced to forfeit because they don't want to get beat up. The next one, another type of ad hominem. All right, so one thing I forgot to state is like, so there are the Latin names for these fallacies along with the English names. I'd suggest you learn both. Some fallacies have only an English name and some fallacies only have a Latin name. However, if you feel like some of these are like really hard to remember, you can only learn the English one, because in the test, you'll have the options for both of them. So both of them will be written down. It won't just be the Latin ones, it won't just be the English ones. So you don't have to worry about that too much. All right. So ad hominem, direct attack, abusive. So now this is like, there's ad hominem, and then there's direct attack within that, and then there's abusive. So this like a subcategory of fallacy. It's literally insulting the opponent. Character or other irrelevant personal qualities of the opponent are presented as if they are evidence against their position, often coupled with insults. Essentially, when you start attacking the opponent by saying things like person X is a liar or person X is stupid, then it's known as abusive ad hominem direct attack. All right. The next one is ad hominem indirect attack, circumstantial. So again, this is a subcategory. Bringing irrelevant facts to distract from the truth is what this essentially is. So you're not directly attacking the person, but you're like bringing up facts that have no like basis in this argument. It's not related to the argument. The position of the opponent is not criticized. Rather, irrelevant personal facts about the opponent are brought in order to undermine their credibility and distract attention of the audience from the topic of the debate. All right. An example of this would be, we should disregard Share BC's argument because they are being funded by the logging industry. Now, this might be a climate debate. And although this might seem like a good argument to make, from a purely pragmatic perspective, this isn't, because it's not related to the debate. The person's or the corporation's view still matters, even though they are being funded by the logging industry. All right. Ad hominem, indirect attack, poisoning the well. Even before the debate starts, this is essentially what this is. So there's a subcategory. So what you're doing is you're not actually attacking them during the debate. You're not bringing up irrelevant personal facts. What you're doing is you're poisoning the well before someone can drink from it, if that makes sense. So committing a preemptive ad hominem attack on the opponent based on personal qualities irrelevant to the debate before the opponent has been able to make his or her case. This may stall the debate and leave the position of the attacker as the apparent winner. So an example of this is someone stating, the person was clearly present at the crime scene and is a thief, said the prosecutor to the journalists and the press before the trial even started. Now, this is actually really dirty, because now the person can't defend him or herself because they're not present there, So this is a fallacy again. Okay. Ad hominem to coke. So this one's pretty simple. Answering an attack with another attack in order to distract from the question. This is essentially, so whenever you're asked, when you're given an attack in an argument or asked a question, you retort to attacking them again rather than answering what their attack state or answering the question. For example, you accuse me of abusing my position, but you're the one whose company car is seen propping up the rails at the local racecourse. Irrelevant, right? Because you accuse me of abusing my position, so you're supposed to respond to that accusation by stating facts like, hey, this is not true because I was doing this and I wasn't actually doing this. But instead you attack the other person. Appeal to pity ad misericordiam, appealing to emotions of pity rather than rationality in order to support a proposition. For example, actually arguing for something, you try to make the audience feel pity for you or the person who you're making the argument for, in order for them to support you and so that you win the argument. Augusto Pinochet is an old dying man, so they want to create that pity in the audience's head, in the judge's head. It is wrong to make him stand trial for alleged offenses. It's fallacious again, because it isn't related to whether he did the crime or not. It doesn't matter that he's old, he's dying, he still committed the crime, and they're not answering the attack that's been placed on him. All right, so strawman. The strawman fallacy is one of the most common ones, and it's pretty important, so you should pay attention here. Oversimplifying the argument is how you can state what strawman essentially is. This is essentially when the argument makes no sense, right? Whenever the statement gives a proof that is completely unrelated, it's almost like the fallacy of irrelevance, right? We're going to talk about the fallacy of irrelevance later, but whenever the statement gives a proof that is completely unrelated, it is almost like the fallacy of strawman fallacy. Oversimplifying or pushing to the extreme the opponent's thesis. The way you can recognize this is like whenever like you see something and the argument makes no sense at all. Like the point that's been made to support the thesis is very irrelevant. It makes absolutely no sense. For example, God must exist, so many people find happiness in religion. Does that It's completely unrelated, right? So that's one way to recognize whenever strawman fallacy is being used in an argument. Okay, ignoratio elenchi, fallacy of irrelevance. It's never asked in test. So this is one fallacy that you don't need to learn, but I explain it regardless. It's present in most arguments. So every argument, like I've said, can be boiled down to it's irrelevant, right? So that's why it's never asked, because you want to be able to make the distinction between different fallacies. And if they ask this in the questions, then, and if you use this, then it'd be correct in most situations. All right. So it's irrelevant. I'm sorry. All right. Fallacy of irrelevance, putting forward a proposition that might be true but has no relation with the conclusion it is purported support. All right. So again, like I said, it's completely unrelated to what you're doing. So if you want, you can skip this, but I'm just explaining it. For example, I read the other day that most people really like the new gun control laws. I was sort of suspicious of them, but I guess if most people like them, then they must be okay, right? You didn't read the gun control laws. Just because most people like it doesn't make it okay. It's irrelevant. Okay. Abuse of authority. All right. So believing a statement by someone just because of their position of authority, appealing to authority rather than rational arguments for the support or dismissal of the proposition. So in this situation, you're abusing your authority or someone else's authority to support your conclusion rather than actually find evidence to support your argument. Now, parents asking you to do something just because they can and because they're older than you. I have many parents say that, hey, don't ask me this question. I'm older than you. I know what's right for you. So they wouldn't explain what's going on. They'd rather just say, just do it. Often abuse of authority. All right. Plurium interrogationem, many questions fallacy. A question is asked that assumes something that hasn't been proven. A question Q is posed to be to the opponent, which implicitly assumes whether a previous question is answered yes or no, right? So people often make this fallacy. For example, how often have you beaten your wife? Now that already assumes that he has beaten his wife, right? It could also be like many questions, literally. So you ask a question that already assumes the answer to previous questions. And it's pretty easy to recognize, but it's often asked in the test. Okay. Shifting the burden of proof. Rather than justifying one's own thesis, forcing the other person to disprove the thesis or to justify their own. This is kind of like to Coke, if that makes sense, right? Because we should implement budget cuts. Give me a reason why we should, right? So he's asking, give me a reason. And rather than providing those reasons, the person resorts to, give me a reason why we shouldn't. Now, shifting the burden of proof to the other person, that doesn't make his argument sound. Petitio principii, begging the question, or circular reasoning. So you can remember any of these names. It's pretty important again. The conclusion is used as the argument, assuming as a premise of the argument its conclusion. The more premises the argument has and the more convoluted it is, the more difficult to spot the circularity. It's very easy to recognize this fallacy because it kind of goes round and round in circles. The conclusion suppose a reasoning, and the reasoning assumes that the conclusion is true. If such actions were not illegal, then they would not be prohibited by the law. It's kind of repetition in some ways. So whenever you feel like an argument is being repetitive, always check for this fallacy. False analogy, using the wrong type of analogy. Pretty simple, very easy, not usually asked in tests. A fallacy which introduces a weak analogy between A and B in order to claim that since A has property B, then also B has property P. Procrastination on homework is bad. It's like waiting until last minute to get cancer treatment. It's just a bad analogy. It's more like a literary fallacy. Hasty generalization. Hasty generalization occurs when conclusions are made based on sample that is too small to represent the whole population, supporting the truth of a proposition by means of a generalization from a few cases which are not representative of the variability of the whole population. So you do something once, for example, or like a small sample size does it, but then you generalize whatever you found you doing that thing once for the whole population of the things. For example, a book I read was bad, hence all books are bad. Now that's hasty generalization. Okay, this one, very important, post hoc, ergo propter hoc. Just because A follows B does not mean that A was caused by B. Succession does not imply causation. So if one thing happens after another thing, doesn't mean that it was caused by the other thing. A cat ran across my path. 10 minutes later, I was hit by a truck. I bet it was a black cat. So you getting hit by the truck happened after the cat crossed your path doesn't mean the cat crossing your path has anything to do with you getting hit by a truck. Okay, cum hoc, ergo propter hoc. Just because there is a relation between the graph of A and B does not mean that there is a direct causation involved. It could be a coincidence. All right, so this is essentially saying that just because two things are correlated doesn't mean that they cause each other. Correlation does not imply causation. There exists a perfect correlation between the number of visitors to the museum and the funding a museum receives. So you would assume that as you increase the funding, the number of visitors increases, but that's correlation. It does not mean that that's necessarily true. right? There could be other factors in that make the number of visitors improve rather than the funding. It's just coincidence, probably. Slippery slope, when the multiple statements lead to a conclusion, or it is like a large event is made probable by smaller events happening. So if one thing small happens, then you kind of go on this tangent and then you assume that something really bad is going to happen. Like, oh, I got a bad grade today. That means I'm not going to get a good grade in this whole semester, and then I'm not going to graduate properly. I'm not going to get a good job, and it's going to ruin my life, and I'm going to be broke. Slippery slope is what that is. Over catastrophizing things. Okay, so we have to stop the tuition increase. The next thing you know, they'll be charging 100,000 for a semester. There was a few $100s of increase in the tuition. You're automatically assuming that they're going to be charging like a lot more next semester. All right, denying the antecedent. Now, this is a really important fallacy. It's usually for arguments that are of the following format. If A, then B. A is known as the antecedent. B is known as the consequence. So if you say, I did not do A, then B will not happen. It is known as denying the antecedent, right? Because the antecedent is A, and you're saying if B happens, then A will not happen. For example, if I have the flu, then I have a sore throat. I have the flu as the antecedent. I have a sore throat as the consequence. I don't have the flu, therefore I will not have a sore throat, right? That's denying the antecedent. Since A is not happening, B will not happen. But that's not really a sound argument, because B could happen, even though it did not happen. You could have a sore throat regardless of the fact that you don't have the flu. Okay, so next one, similar to that, is affirming the consequent. It's also the same format. Okay, so affirming the consequent, right? It's also of the same form as denying the antecedent. So if A, then B, A is the antecedent, B is the consequence, right? So in the sentence denying the antecedent that we did before, we're actually denying the main statement happening. So we say that B did not happen, so the consequent did not happen, so A must not have happened. Here we do the opposite. So we say I got B, then like A definitely happened, right? Which is, again, not a very good reasoning, because for B to happen, A has to happen. So if you say, if I have the flu, then I have a sore throat. I have a sore throat, therefore I have the flu. So that doesn't really work, because you could have a sore throat and you could not have the flu. So again, it's very fallacious. And I think you need to remember what the antecedent is, what the consequent is, know the order of the things, and really find the difference between these two fallacies, because people often make mistakes there. Fallacy of composition, pretty simple. So if A constitutes of B and B has a property P, doesn't mean that A does have the property P as well. To deduce from the fact that all the component parts of a whole possess the property P that the whole possesses. In simple words, assuming that if like the individual parts have a certain property, then the whole thing also has that property. The food is definitely going to be delicious since all its ingredients are delicious too, right? That's fallacious. The ingredients could be delicious, but the food as a whole could not be. Fallacy of division is the opposite of the fallacy of composition. So if A constitutes of B and has a property P, doesn't mean that its subparts have as well. So if the whole has a property, then doesn't mean its ingredients and its like subparts have those properties as well. To deduce from the fact that all the component parts of a whole possess the property P that the whole possesses, P as well. The ingredients are obviously delicious as the food is so delicious, right? Now it's like the reverse of the fallacy of composition, but again, for the same reason, it's wrong. Argumentum ad ignorantium, absence of evidence fallacy. So absence of evidence for a proposition does not constitute evidence for its contrary. Instead of proving your case using evidence, you say that since there is no evidence, I'm guilty. I'm not guilty. Example, no one knows it is true, therefore it is false. That's a fallacious argument, clearly, because it could be true, but no one has evidence for it. So absence of evidence does not make the argument true or false, depending on which one you're trying to prove. The gambler's fallacy. This is like a probabilistic error, inferring that a certain outcome of a random trial is more likely given that a specific history of outcomes of previous statistically independent random trials has been observed. This might make sense for all the stats and probability students and all the math kids, but in simple terms, it's using the history of a certain event to predict the next event. For example, if you got sixes in a row when you roll a dice, doesn't mean that the seventh one is more probable to be six. The probability of getting a 6 is still 1/6. So having the previous 6 winning outcomes does not change the fact that this one could be any other number. It's equally probable that's 1, that's 2, or 3, or 4, and so on, right? Another example is when tossing a coin, 10 heads came. So like when you toss a coin 10 times, you got heads 10 times. So you assume that the next one will also probably be a heads, when in reality, the probability is still 50%. The fact that there were 10 heads before does not change the probability that this time is still going to be 50%, because flipping a coin is an independent event, right? So this one, that you don't usually ask that, but it's good to like understand. It's a bit more complicated, so you'll have to pay attention here. Okay. False dilemma, bifurcation fallacy. Assuming that there are only two possible options. So if one does not happen, then the other has to happen. False dilemma fallacy is like assuming that there are only two different ways something could go. Arguing for proposition P by assuming without support that either P or Q must be the case. If P is not the case, then Q must be the case. If Q is not the case, then P must be the case. There's no middle ground. There's no third option. That's a very common fallacy. For example, be my friend or be my enemy, right? You could either be my friend or you could or the complete opposite, be my enemy. There's no in between. And that's a fallacy, because you could just be like on neutral terms with someone, you know? You could just like not know someone. Not everyone in the world is your friend or enemy. There's so many different options. So this is a good example of the bifurcation fallacy. All right, so that was all the 23 fallacies. Here are some tips to help you through the tests and stuff and what you'll need. So in the test, you'll be asked to recognize the type of fallacy similar to the type of biases. So you'll be asked to recognize the fallacy that's being used in a certain statement, and then explain why that fallacy is being used. For that reason, you'll have to learn the definitions and the explanation. Because if you don't know the definitions, then not like in an exact word-to-word manner, but you still need to understand the basic definition of it so that you can explain it when they ask you to do that, because that's half the grade. Half the grade is explanation, the other half is just selecting the right answer. So learning the important ones. So I've started like the ones if you've noticed, I've started a few fallacies. Those are the most important ones. Focus more on them. They're a lot more tricky as well. Another tip is paying close attention to the ones that are similar. So people often confuse, like you might know that there's like a clear distinction between all the fallacies, but some of the fallacies don't have that clear distinction. They're very similar. So people often choose the other one instead of the correct one. So if you know the pairs, so you know like which ones are similar, you can always test both of them for the argument and make sure that you're not choosing the wrong one, right? I'll show you which ones are similar on the next page. Similar to the biases, each fallacy is only asked once in the test. So they only ask you once, the whole fallacy. So if you get the same fallacy again, then you know you're doing something wrong. The last tip I'd like to tell you is fallacies are a lot more important than biases. So learn the biases, they're pretty important, but pay more attention to fallacies, learn more of their definitions, because they'll be worth more on the test. Okay. Similar fallacies. So ad hominem, to quote, and shifting burden of proof, right? Those two, people often confuse them on the test. So if you feel like you got ad hominem on the test to coke, then you should always test shifting burden of proof to make sure that that isn't actually the correct answer. Similarly, post hoc, ergo propter hoc, and cum hoc, ergo propter hoc, they're very similar in names as well as like what they do. So you should always like test both of them again. Denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent. This is by far the one where people make the most mistakes. Learn to understand the difference. It's right there in the sentence, denying the antecedent. So when the antecedent is being denied, it's denying the antecedent. Affirming the consequent. When you're supporting the consequence, then it's affirming the consequent. Not that hard. Both of them, however, are in the same format of like if A, then B. So you should always test both of them just to be sure. Fallacy of composition, fallacy of division, they're just opposites of each other. So people often make that mistake. Learn the distinction and make sure you don't make that mistake in the test. So yeah, finally, whenever you feel like one of these is the answer, make sure that the other one is in the actual answer by testing both of them, just to be sure. These are the most important ones as well. For the homework, so there's like AUC has a great YouTube channel about logic, where they explain the different fallacies by giving examples from movies and TV shows, and that's a very good way of learning the difference between the fallacies and learning the examples. So go and watch those videos. The link is in the slides, which I'll be posting after this. Fallacies in argumentation part 1 and part 2. For me, when I was learning the fallacies, this really helped me like put the idea in my head, because I'm a very visual and auditory learner. So I'm sure it'll be useful for you if you're that type of person as well. Memorize all the fallacies and biases. So like learn to list them down without reading from a list. So learn all the different type of fallacies. Learn the basic definition, how to differentiate between things. Don't learn the exact definition. Don't waste your time doing that, but like learn the essence of what the fallacy is talking about, what the bias is talking about. Complete all the Sowieso exercises. So there are exercises on Sowieso that'll be available to you after the class. Complete all of them. And lastly, if you have any doubts, send them to me at uzairhanure786 @gmail.com, and I will respond in 2 to 3 working days max. So, but try them on your own first. So if you only when you can't do them at all. So once you go through all the series exams, there's some questions that you're getting wrong, you don't know what you're doing wrong, only then send them to me. All right. Yeah, so that was it for today, guys. I'll see you on the next class. Bye.